Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce MOA's General Counsel, Major General Joe Lynch.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me all right?
We can hear you.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. First, I'd like to say it's good to be with you again. The Florida Council has always had a special place in my heart since I came to MOA. I've been able to attend a number of chapter meetings down there and council events. And I really have a great deal of respect and admiration for the Florida Council. And I want to thank the Florida Council for its leadership, not only in the state of Florida, but for the example that it sets throughout MOA of a well-organized, well-run affiliate program. And I think, Mike, you and your team down there deserve a lot of credit for that. It takes a lot of work, a lot of volunteer time. And I can tell you, we see that up here. And we see the difference in what you're doing up here. And we have the greatest respect and admiration for everything that you put in down there in Florida. It makes MOA stronger. I want to cover a couple of key legal issues today. Some of these things you've heard about before, but they're worth re-emphasizing from time to time. And sometimes when we go back and cover things again, it may generate some more questions. So, please feel free to use the chat function to generate questions, and Aaron will pass those on to me as we work through the morning. What are we going to talk about today? Well, I've got a couple of things on my list. It won't take me a really long time to get through them. It sounds like a lot, but it's some of the things you're already familiar with. First, I want to talk a little bit about the legal status of our affiliates. That's an issue that there's often a lot of confusion about, because different veterans organizations do it differently. And I want to make sure you understand and have an appreciation for the MOA model and what it means for your oversight of your chapter structure. I want to talk a little bit about the relationship with MOA National, the importance of incorporating your affiliate, your chapter, very important issue that you need to consider. I'm going to give you a little bit of a high-level touch on the IRS rules for tax-exempt status. If you're a new chapter leader, for example, you need to make sure you review all of your chapter documents and make sure that you're, number one, incorporated, number two, have tax-exempt status. And of course, part of that is make sure you have separate financial records and separate accounts for all of the chapter's finances and resources. I will talk a little bit about the process for getting your chapter incorporated in the state. I'm going to cover a little bit about chapter solicitations. Many of our chapters have 501c3 scholarship funds and other charitable organizations connected to them, and they do some fundraising. And there's special rules that kick in when you do fundraising. I also want to take a moment and talk a little bit about chapter newsletters and websites, and I'll talk about the issue with DoD and service seals and emblems at that time. And then I'll wrap up by telling you a little bit about the great resources that are available to you as chapter leaders. Aaron, can I have the next slide? Yeah, what's the legal status of our chapters and our councils? They're affiliates. They're independent, self-governing, and self-supporting organizations. The MOA Charter authorizes council and chapters to associate and affiliate with MOA and to use MOA's name, logo, and tagline, all of our registered MOA symbols and terms you are authorized to use for your chapter by virtue of your charter as a chartered MOA chapter. What's the relationship with the national? Remember that we're separate and distinct organizations. MOA chapters are not agents or subsidiaries of MOA. They can't speak for MOA National. They can certainly speak for themselves, and they can take a position on national issues if they like, but they can't speak as MOA National. And they're not covered by two important things. One, they're not covered by MOA's tax-exempt status. They have to have their own tax-exempt status, and they're not covered by MOA's liability insurance. And in recent years, that's become more of an important issue than it has been in the past. And I'll talk a little bit about liability insurance later in the presentation. Next slide, please. What about your legal status? Well, as I mentioned a minute ago, if you're a new chapter leader, you need to take a look at all of your chapter's organizational documents. You need to determine what kind of a creature this chapter that I'm taking over? Is it a corporation? Is it an unincorporated association? Just exactly what is it? Well, you're going to find that out in your chapter documents. And if you don't have those chapter documents, you can usually go to the State Corporation Commission and get a copy of your articles of incorporation. And oftentimes the State Corporation Commission will often have a copy of your bylaws, but typically they would be the initial bylaws of the organization and not the current ones. So you need to maintain your own record of bylaws. And when you change your bylaws, you need to make sure that your bylaws document is updated to reflect that change so it's kept current. One of the things that's particularly helpful to you as you look at possibly incorporating an unincorporated chapter is to go to the MOA Council and Chapter Policies and Procedures Guide. That provides really, really useful templates for articles of incorporation and bylaws. It's very, very good. The other thing is the website for the Secretary of State or the State Corporation Commission, which is the entity that approves your incorporated status, which grants you the legal status as a separate legal entity in your state. That provides in their website detailed instructions and forms to use to get incorporated. Now, a number of my chapter leaders have come back to me and said, well, we really need to get a lawyer to do this. We don't have the money to get a lawyer to do this. It's complicated. It's got all sorts of things. Well, the truth of the matter is you don't really need to have a lawyer. This is an officers association with well-educated and highly experienced people who are used to dealing with complex issues. MOA chapters, corporate organizations on the hierarchy of simple to complex corporate organizations, they are way over on the simple side. You don't have shareholders. You're not selling stock. You're not going to have an IPO. You're not going to be regulated by the SEC. And that's a Securities and Exchange Commission, not the Southeastern Conference. And so it's not that difficult. I really think any member of our MOA family, as a retired military officer or just an experienced military officer, can read the instructions on the website and look at the template in the Policies and Procedures Guide and come up with the documents that you need to do that. And I don't think you'll have much difficulty at all. What you need to look for, though, when you're on the Secretary of State's website is to make sure you use the correct type of corporate organization. Not-for-profit organizations, which is what you want to be, don't have owners. They tend to have members. And so you need to create the appropriate organization. In most states, they generally refer them as nonprofit corporations. In Virginia, they're referred to as non-stock corporations, but they usually have specific organizational requirements that you have to meet. They're not particularly difficult. And once you're able to do that, you submit your articles of incorporation, your initial bylaws, you have your initial incorporating board of directors. In most states, usually it's just 3 individuals, and that gets you launched. And then you can move on from that to the IRS tax exempt status. Aaron, can I have the next slide, please? For your IRS tax exempt status, there's a number of different options that you have. And I think all of you have heard me talk before about the different types of tax exempt organizations under the IRS tax code. The first and probably the best recognized one is the 501c19 Veterans Organization. That's what MOA National is. And that's a very, very good form of tax exempt status to hold. The reason for that is it makes the income to the organization free from federal taxation. That's the income coming in to the organization, whether it's dues, whether it's advertising revenue, whatever it is just a general rule is exempt from taxation. The drawback to that is in most cases, the donations and the dues paid to a 501c19 veterans organization are not tax deductible to the person paying them. And that's a major difference between a 501c19 and several other types of 501c organizations. A chapter could also, while we tend to prefer the 501c19 status, a chapter could also organize as a C4. Both the C19 and the C4 allow the organization to advocate and lobby for changes in legislation, which is good. And The social welfare C4 organization has the benefit of not having to meet strict veterans representation requirements in its membership. But we tend to prefer the C19 status as the preferred status. If the chapter or the organization is not going to be involved in direct lobbying, going up on Capitol Hill or going to your state capitol and engaging legislators on changing or pressing for legislation, if you're not going to be doing that, you could form as a C3. And if you form as a C3, while you can't directly lobby, the dues and the donations to the C3 are tax deductible to the donor, and they're also exempt from taxation to the organization. So it does give some benefits. A number of our chapters across the country have organized as C19s, but they've established a scholarship fund like MOA has, that's a C3 subsidiary, and that enables them to get their preferred tax treatment of the donations to their scholarship fund. The exempt status, it's granted by the IRS or denied by the IRS. They want to review your articles of incorporation and your other organizational documents. And what status you're in, whether you're a C19 or a C4 or C3, it really depends on what your organization's mission is. And there's an excellent workbook that Terry and Aaron have put together to support these programs. And it's got a table in the back of it. I don't remember the exact appendix number. It might be 1 or it might be 3, but it's got a great table that Aaron worked up that kind of sets out, if you're going to do this as your mission, probably the best IRS tax exempt status to have is a C19 or a C3 or a C4, depending on what you're going to be doing. The other thing you should keep in mind is IRS on its website has some great resources. I know that sounds kind of not believable, but it's actually true. And in the case of tax exempt organizations, IRS publication 557 is very, very good and very, very helpful. And I'll refer to some more resources when I get to the end of the presentation. Can I have the next slide, Aaron? Okay, what's the process? Suppose you find you're not incorporated and you want to get incorporated. What do you need to do? Well, of course, you need to go to the state, Secretary of State or the Corporation Commission's website. The first thing you need to do is check the name availability to make sure nobody else has already registered that name. And I think for most cases for a MOA chapter or a MOA organization, we haven't had much of a problem with people running out and registering our names. There's a fee in Virginia, it's just $75. The forms are available on the website, and typically you can submit them electronically. And most states can do this in about 10 days. It's not a real difficult thing to get done. One other thing you're going to need is you're going to need an employer ID number from the IRS. That's very easy to get. You can go on the IRS website. You can just put in the relevant information about the organization on the website, and they can grant the employer ID number very, very quickly without any hassle at all. It's a pretty straightforward thing. That just enables the IRS to keep track of every taxable or non-taxable entity in the country. Those of you who may have been executor of an estate for a relative or a friend, or if you're a legal practice, when you do an estate, you have to open the estate with its own employer ID number for the estate. Even though it doesn't employ anybody, the IRS wants to keep track of that separate legal entity for tax purposes. So the IRS has kind of got a system and procedures in place for doing this pretty efficiently. And I've done it several times, both for estates and for corporations. And I found it to be pretty straightforward. And for an IRS issue, surprisingly simple and efficient. The IRS will determine the tax exempt status. You want to file the correct IRS form. The publication 557 will be helpful with that. The forms are not complex. They're not anything like your 1040 or your Schedule A or even worse yet, your Schedule K. It's much easier stuff that you can do to get this thing done. The filing fee is typically $600, but I understand if you're a 501c3 charity, you can get it for $275. It takes 60 to 90 days to get this through the IRS. I will tell you there have been times when we have incorporated things at MOA, some of our subsidiaries, that has taken longer. It's taken 3, 4, 5 months to get it through. But I think these days they're much more efficient, and there isn't as much of a backlog as there was 7 or 8 years ago when we were doing that. Also, you need to remember to file your annual nonprofit tax return. Just because you're a nonprofit doesn't mean you don't have an obligation to file a Form 990 or the abbreviated Form 990 to keep your organization up to date with the IRS. That's fairly easy to do as well. You should just have a little checklist along with your corporate documents, and you can be sure that you've done all of these things when they're needed. For MOA, for example, we file our 990, on the corporation itself, and we file a 990 for each of our subsidiary organizations. And it's really very important to do that, particularly if you're soliciting charitable donations to support a scholarship fund or some other public service program. You have the next slide. Charitable solicitations. This is an area that you have to be careful in. Remember now, a tax-exempt organization doesn't mean that charitable contributions to that organization are going to be deductible to the individual who gives it to you. It means it's income exempt from you. It doesn't mean it's deductible to the individual who pays the dues or makes a contribution. So you have to keep that distinction in mind. If you're soliciting charitable contributions, let's say it's for a scholarship fund or some other charitable purpose, there are state registration requirements that have to be met. And there's registration requirements in all states, and they have to be renewed annually. Now, this is where it gets to be somewhat complicated. Now, if you're a Florida chapter, and let's say you have a 501c3 scholarship fund subsidiary, and you're soliciting donations in Florida, you just need to register with Florida. It's not particularly complicated. But you have to be careful that you don't end up soliciting outside of Florida, because if you're soliciting outside of Florida, you have to register in the states where you're soliciting. So that creates a couple of problems. One is you go out and you do crowdfunding. Well, that typically is going to cross state lines, whether you intend it to or not, and that's going to possibly trigger registration requirements in other states. You have to pay the state's filing fee. It's not a huge fee, but it's something that you have to pay. And just a website solicitation itself may trigger out-of-state registration requirements if it can be accessed by people out of state, and most websites can be. So you need to be aware of that. We have the MOA Foundation and the MOA Scholarship Fund, and we solicit in all 50 states. And we welcome charitable contributions. We welcome bequests and trust contributions. And we have a registration requirement where we have to register in every single state. Well, we actually contract that out to an attorney who specializes in that out in California, who handles all that for us. And it's a very efficient and effective way to do it. It's not particularly expensive because he's got this thing down as a set process and procedure in his office. And it works very efficiently for us. And it assures us that we're in compliance with state law across the country when we solicit charitable solicitations. Next slide, please, Aaron. Liability insurance. This is an issue that often draws a lot of comments and concerns from our chapter community. One thing, there's a couple of things you have to think about when you think about insurance. Number one, bad things can happen. And you don't think much about that until one of them does happen. If your car backs into somebody else's car in a parking lot, or you get rear-ended, or you rear-end somebody else at a red light, you're really glad that you've got automobile liability insurance to cover you. If you're a MOA member, you would typically have USAA automobile liability insurance. But the liability insurance is a very, very important factor. And it comes up in a number of different ways. When my son was in college down in southwestern Virginia, he rented an old farmhouse, an old wooden farmhouse with a bunch of his buddies. And through a variety of different things that they were involved in, the farmhouse caught fire and burned to the ground. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. Everybody was fine, but the farmhouse was gone, and the farmer was really pissed off. So he looked around and he found the only family that had any insurance coverage was me. So my wife and I got sued for my son's burning down the farmhouse. Fortunately, USAA stepped in, picked it up, handled everything, got the case dismissed, and we lived happily ever after. Without insurance, even if we ultimately prevailed on liability, the cost of defending that case would have been somewhere around $50,000. And we would have had to pay that. So insurance is really, really important. And your homeowner's insurance doesn't cover what you do as a chapter or council officer. It might cover your son if he burns down the house he's renting, but it won't cover you as a council or chapter officer. The other thing you have to keep in mind is, as a chapter, you have a duty to be a responsible member of your community. So if you're engaged in activities that might, if things go wrong, harm somebody, you need to be in a position to make it right. That's your responsibility as a member of your community. So you need to think that through a little bit, and these things can come up in any number of ways. A automobile accident or collision in a parade can present a problem. You can run into issues with injuries at a MOA chapter event in a hotel. The hotels will typically write their event contracts to put all the liability on the organization. So you have to be careful of that and make sure you have insurance coverage for it. Litigation, as I mentioned before, is very expensive. So even if you have a frivolous claim, you could easily spend $30,000 to $50,000 defending it, even if you ultimately win. And in the United States, if you win in a lawsuit, you don't get the other side to pay your attorney fees. You still have to pay them. So that's something to think about with insurance. Now, what can we do about insurance? Let me have the next slide, please, Aaron. Insurance for chapter activities. Our insurance partner, Mercer Health and Benefits Administration, has a general liability insurance policy that they have that applies to councils and chapters. It provides coverage of legal fees, even if the suit lacks merit. It covers up to $2 million in general liability coverage. What does it cost? It really depends on the size of the chapter and what type of events and activities you're engaged in. Generally, it's around $300 to $350 a year. And I know that's an expense that a lot of chapters would really like to avoid. And I know that's a big hit on your chapter budgets. But you need to think about this a little bit. If you were running your own business in your community, you would have to spend the $300 and $350 out of your own pocket to get your insurance. So as a chapter officer, you need to take a look at your chapter budget and your chapter revenues and find a way of covering this type of expense. Now, I would make one other comment here. You also need to think about what you're doing as a chapter. If you're not engaging in events that have some type of exposure, you're probably okay without having the insurance, but you need to make sure that you're not going to find yourself in a situation where somebody comes up with a claim. Maybe it's food poisoning at a chapter luncheon. And so even if that's dismissed because you had the caterer, and the caterer ought to be liable for that. If you're in the lawsuit, you've got to get out of it, and that costs money to get out of it, and insurance would cover that cost. The other thing I'd mention to you is we're not just pushing the Mercer insurance. We know that in a number of communities, your local commercial insurance broker may be able to come up with a good association insurance policy that might cover you. And you may want to look at that. You don't just have to take Mercer, but try to get the best deal that you can. Next slide, please. Other issues, chapter newsletters and websites. As you can imagine, over the past year and a half, this has become a very sensitive issue. What you say in your newsletter and what you say on your website gets attention. And while we can't dictate what you can say and what you can't say, there are things you need to be aware of and things that we strongly recommend that you stay away from. The first one is divisive social issues. Remember that when you issue a MOA newsletter for your chapter, you're using the MOA brand and you're using the MOA association with the national office, and you're speaking for the organization, not yourself personally, and not just the members of your organization who come to your luncheons and may think about these social issues the same way you do. You have to sit back and say, what are we trying to do with this publication? We're trying to represent MOA as an organization that welcomes everybody in the military community who are officers into our association. And if you take a position on divisive social issues, and there have been several lately, one, for example, that generated a lot of discussion was the NFL players kneeling. And people don't like that. I understand they don't like that, but there's some members of the MOA community who feel that they have a right to protest racial injustice or injustice in the administration of of arrests and criminal prosecutions, and that's appropriate. So what we tell people, and we're asked at the MOA national level, we don't take a position on those issues. People don't join MOA, so MOA can take a position on social issues. They join MOA because we're an advocacy organization, and we work to protect the earned benefits of the military community. And while we all have our own personal feelings about these issues, it really isn't our place to express them on behalf of MOA, either nationally or as an individual chapter. So we tend to stay away from that, and we recommend that our chapters do that as well. And you find these issues all over the place. For example, nonviolent protests. Well, let's say there's a Black Lives Matter protest. Well, that can cause a lot of debate and discussion in your local community, and it's one of those divisive social issues. We don't take a position on these issues because we're afraid of them. The reason we don't take a position on these issues is because we have an obligation to represent in our positions a broad consensus of what our MOA members feel and believe in. And on issues like this, we know MOA members are not of one mind. Some see no problem at all with the Black Lives Matter movement and with supporting their protests of racial injustice and supporting their protest against police, what they perceive as police brutality. Some MOA members are good with that. Other MOA members are outraged by that. And what we do as MOA, because we can't take one issue or the other and purport to speak for the entire MOA community, we don't take an issue on these divisive social issues. And we just recommend that the chapters and their newsletters and websites, give some thought before they think about expressing some opinion on these issues. A somewhat difficult issue, but also a different issue, but also related, is partisan political issues. Now, MOA as a 501c19 and our chapters that are 501c19s are authorized to lobby and to influence political issues. You can influence legislation in the political process, but what you can't do is get involved in partisan political activities. Well, what's the distinction between getting involved in political issues and partisan political issues? What the partisan political issues are taking a position that supports or opposes one candidate for public office or another, or against one, or supports one political party versus another political party in a public election. And so you will notice that in the course of the last presidential election, in the course of the recent Georgia runoff, we took no position at all on MOA. That's an issue for people to vote their conscience on and do what they feel is right. And the reason we don't do that is simply because for our tax exempt status, we have to remain neutral on partisan political issues. It's a condition of having this tax exemption. And we understand that, we respect that, we comply with the law, we have an obligation to comply with the law, and we do so by not taking positions on partisan political issues. And it can sometimes get injected into your communications without consciously thinking that. And I recall a couple of months ago, we had an issue come up in one of our chapters. It wasn't in Florida, but essentially a chapter president put an article in his chapter newspaper, which was, quite frankly, the exact talking point of the Republican Party in the presidential campaign. Well, they didn't say vote Republican, and they didn't say vote for President Trump. They didn't say vote against former Vice President Biden, but it was clear that anybody who was tuned into the TV or the radio or the newspaper exactly what they were saying. And that's also a foul. That is engaging in partisan political issues, even if you don't say the name of the party or you don't say the name of the candidate. If what you're saying can be identified, reasonably identified with that party or that candidate, then you need to be careful and not go there. It puts your tax exempt status at risk. And the other thing that it does is it also sends a message to potential MOA members that, if you're not one of us in our party or supporting our candidate, we don't want you in MOA. And that's not the case at all. We want to be welcome to all members of the military officer community, active and retired. Now, let me go to the next issue here, which is important. And this has come up more recently. It is service seals and symbols. General Atkins mentioned this earlier. A few years back, the services got very concerned about commercial companies taking military seals, the Eagle Globe and Anchor of the Marine Corps, for example, or Air Force pilots' wings, putting them on coffee cups and T-shirts and selling them for a profit. And DOD went back and the services went back and they made sure that all of their service seals and most of their symbols are trademarked. And what that means, you can't use them without their permission. So the service seals, which we're all used to seeing around all the time, military symbols, like for example, rank symbols, the eagle from a colonel or a captain's uniform, all of those things are essentially trademarked, and you can't use them without permission. So you have to be very careful there. Occasionally we'll find a symbol that's not trademarked. And I had a chapter in Maryland call me the other day and say, hey, we found this symbol, we'd like to use it in our newsletter, but we're afraid it might be a DOD registered symbol. And I said, well, send it to me. So they sent it to me. And it was this generic eagle that's kind of, laying flat on his back with his wings spread. And I call it the roadkill eagle. So I looked up the roadkill eagle, and nobody owns the roadkill eagle. So I said, guys, you can go for it. You can use the roadkill eagle all you want. And I think they didn't like the way I referred to their eagle, so I don't think they ended up using it. But it was an example of, not everything is covered, but you can do it. If you have a question, you can go to the website of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and you can actually look up the symbols by looking at pictures of them. It's somewhat tedious, but you can get there and kind of figure that out. So be careful of that. You can't use it you can't use the seals or symbols to identify your chapter. You can't incorporate them into the header or title of your newsletter without prior permission. And I can tell you that the prior permission is probably not going to be granted. I can't think of a single time DOD or the services have granted permission to a non-federal entity to use their symbol. Now, there are some times when a symbol might be appropriate to be used in a publication. And we had one recently in the magazine where we had a map of the US and we showed where military installations were. And each installation was identified by service with the seal of that service. Well, that's okay because you're not converting that seal to a MOA use. You're using it to just be descriptive of what's there. And that's okay. That's not a trademark violation. But you just can't adopt it and say, this is the MOA chapter and have all 7, now 8 seals of the uniformed services across your letterhead. Finally, I mention to you again, chapters are authorized to use MOA seals and symbols. So, we have the MOA symbol, we have MOA taglines, never stop serving, one powerful voice. All of those things are registered. We own the rights to those. And because you're a chartered chapter, you have the right to use those in your publications and on your website. Next slide, Aaron. Resources. These are important. I'd say one of the best resources there is for a council and chapter leadership is the Council and Chapter Policies and Procedures Guide. When I first came to MOA, and I was kind of thinking through, what do we do with 400 chapters running around out there? And, how do they know how to get organized? How do they know what to do? And then somebody showed me the Chapter Policies and Procedures Guide, and I said, oh my God, this is golden. This is fantastic. I mean, you can take the Policies and Procedures Guide, and I would say easily 80 to 90% of the regular everyday questions that you have will be answered in that guide. It is excellent. It has templates of bylaws and other things. It gives you a lot of good hints and insight on how to deal with corporate governance issues that you're going to have as a chapter leader. So I think it's really, really great. And I have to give Aaron and Terry and the council and chapter leadership staff just the highest compliments for the great work they did putting that together. It's very, very useful. The other thing we have is the Council and Chapter Affairs Leaders Workbook. The Leaders Workbook is also very, very good. It gets to a little bit more of a level of detail than the Council and Chapter Procedures Guide, and it focuses a little bit more on current issues that have come to Aaron's and Terry's attention from chapter leaders and tries to address them. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier that's in here, it's in one of the appendix sections in the back, is a really helpful table on, organizationally under the IRS code, where does your organization fit? Should it be a 19? Should it be a C3? Should it be a C4? And there's a very helpful little table back there that allows you to sort that out. And then also, of course, there's information from Mercer, which is available to you on club and chapter liability insurance plans. And that's also a useful resource. It tells you what's covered and what's not, it tells you the limits of liability, what the aggregate liability is, and issues like that, and then what the cost is. And I think you'll find that to be very useful. Can I have the next slide? And of course, there's the IRS publications. 3386 is the guide for veterans organizations. Very useful. It focuses specific on veterans organizations, the requirements for a C19. How many veteran members do you need to have? Well, you have to have 75% in most cases. If you want your dues and your donations to the C19 to be tax deductible, then the C19 has to have 90% war veteran membership. And most of our chapters, and MOA itself nationally doesn't qualify for that because we have our surviving spouse members. And we can't count them as war veterans toward that 90% requirement. So we're what we call a 75% 501c19, which means we are tax exempt for our income and dues, but the dues and the contributions are not deductible to our members. IRS publication 557, which I mentioned before, talks about the tax exempt status, sets out the procedures, shows you what the forms are and how to do that. And then IRS publication 4221 is a compliance guide for 501c3 public charities. So if you have a 501c3 a scholarship fund that you've organized as a public charity, that is the reference guide that should be able to answer most of the questions you have concerning that organization. Finally, I want to mention two of the most important and useful resources that we've got. One is Colonel Terry Coles, the Senior Director, and the other is Captain Aaron Stone, the Program Director for Council and Chapter Affairs. I work with these staff members every day. We deal with a lot of issues that come up across the country. And let me tell you something, they really know their stuff. They know the IRS rules. They know the issues in corporate governance. They know what we call kind of the hot button issues of the day. And they're a great resource for all of our council and chapter leaders. So I would encourage you to not hesitate to reach out to them if you can't get your answer in the Policy and Procedures Guide or in one of the IRS publications. Can I have the next slide, please? Well, it looks like you have survived another general counsel briefing. I'd like to pass out a pin or a coin or something, but because we're virtual, I can't do that. But hopefully there were some things here in the briefing that you found useful, and I hope it clarified as opposed to confused you on the issues that you're dealing with in running your chapter and Mike in running the council. And just keep in mind that with the national office, we're here. Our job is to support the council and chapter program and our council and chapter affiliate organizations. And that's what we try to do every day. You are a vital lifeblood of MOA. You provide a real important capability to MOA, not only at the state and local level, but also at the federal level through your relationship with your elected federal representatives. And we want to do everything we can to support your efforts. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Aaron to see if that generated any questions.
Thank you, General Lynch. Yes, we have more questions than we have time. We have about 5 minutes. So as a reminder, if you put your questions in the chat, if General Lynch is unable to answer them in the time allotted, we will make sure that we get you answers and we'll feed those back probably as soon as tomorrow. So first question, this is from a chapter president. My chapter is a C3. I sit on several veterans councils, and one is a Florida state veterans organization that once a year we storm the Florida Capitol in support of Florida legislation for veterans. Does this constitute lobbying as a C3 chapter and make us not eligible to be a C3?
That's a good question. And the reason it's a good question is, as much as I've complimented the IRS for how helpful they are when it comes to their publications and their forms and getting tax exempt status, There are some areas in IRS law that are almost intentionally ambiguous. And one of them is just what can C3s do in terms of lobbying and influencing legislation. Well, the general IRS rule is that C3s may not use any substantial part of their resources for lobbying. What is a substantial portion of your resources? I mean, if you're a little small chapter, and I think most of us are, if you're not devoting more than 10% of your expenses or your volunteer time to lobbying, you are probably okay. But if you're, for example, the AARP, and let's say, I think they're a C4, but let's say you had a nationwide a C3, and they were making $50 million a year in revenue, if they were spending 10%, that would be considered a substantial part of their resources, even though it's the same percentage. So it's kind of somewhat of a sliding scale. But remember, there's a very specific definition for lobbying, and it really involves the effort and the contact with the legislators and public officials to influence a specific piece of legislation. Now, a lot of things that we do are involved with that, but that doesn't necessarily mean we can't influence legislation in other ways. C3s are authorized and permitted to educate lawmakers and public officials on the issues and to point out to them why those issues are important to be decided a certain way because it benefits the military community. It doesn't mean you're going to go in there and say, we want section, 2741 of the NDAA adopted because we need to have the specific protection for retired military officers. But what it does mean is that, look, there's important issues and we need as a Congress and as a country to be able to protect our veterans and to take into account their service and sacrifice over many years. So you can do the educational pitch without any problem at all. The direct lobbying, which is the direct influencing of legislation, you're limited by this no substantial resources rule. And as long as it's minimal and incidental, like I would imagine this Florida Veterans Council is probably like a once a year, maybe one day activity. And if that's what it is, I don't think you're going to trigger the substantial resources problem. Did that get your question?
All right, we have no response on that. We'll come back to it if we need to.
Okay.
I want to call on George Leonardos for a question. It may be the last, depending on the length. Go ahead, George. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, good morning. Hi, everybody. How are you? We're the St. Augustine chapter here in Florida. So when you're talking about Florida issues, it was nice to hear about them. And I posed the question earlier, and I probably will get an answer by tomorrow. Our chapter was involved in a lawsuit over the summer concerning the removal of Confederate monuments, which we didn't consider Confederate. They were actually war memorials. We joined with our local St. Johns County Veterans Council and with descendants of the people who were represented on the monument itself. I checked with MOA National and asked if we would get in trouble as a MOA chapter by joining as a co-plaintiff in the lawsuit. After some research, we got a call back and it was explained to us and by email, as long as it was kept non-political, we'd be okay. There was a fine line between getting involved in a lawsuit, never mind just that, with the monument, but any kind of lawsuit that we felt a social obligation, not a political obligation, but a social obligation for the community to be involved in. What I'm hearing today now is perhaps that could have been a mistake. Can we comment on that?
Well, I would say you have to be careful of what I would say are divisive social issues. I'm not sure, because of the issues of statuary are very community and local specific. It's a very fact specific issue. I'll just give you an example. I'm a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute, and VMI's had some tough issues because of the statues that it has on campus. It had this big statue of Stonewall Jackson that was out in front of the barracks. And the state of Virginia said, you got to take that down, and it's now gone. But we have another statue, which is Virginia mourning her dead. And buried around that statue are 7 VMI cadets who were killed in the Battle of Newmarket in the Civil War. And the question is that a Confederate memorial? Well, when you actually read the plaques and you read the information on that memorial, it's not specific to the Confederacy, never makes reference to the Confederacy or the Civil War. So you can make the argument, well, that's not necessarily a monument that that promotes the Confederacy, that promotes the Civil War revolution back in the 1860s. You know, thousands of VMI graduates have died in battle over the years, and we tend to treat that as a memorial to all of them. So it just kind of depends on what the issue is. I think your local sensitivity to that, because this issue, this lawsuit is essentially a local issue and not a national issue right now. I think is best for you to assess, and what type of whether your participation in the lawsuit on one side or the other is likely to drive away potential MOA members because of the position we're taking. And if it's likely to do that, we probably ought to not go there. But on the other hand, if it's something that you sense is something that's not going to have that unintended consequence, then I think your judgment on that is good.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you, General Lynch.